Just like me reaching for the top shelf in Tesco without asking my wife for uppies, sometimes games get ported to weaker handhelds just to see if it's possible. But just like how I usually have to ask her to fetch my cookie crisp, the end result can be a bit embarrassing. For instance, it took like nearly a decade for WWE 2K to return to a Nintendo console after the disaster of WWE 2K18. Not the case with these impossible handheld ports though, which through one way or another pulled off the unthinkable. Hey, one of them even made a bad game pretty good. Bringing Dragon's Lair to the Game Boy Color was an absurd technical challenge. Actually, just a bit stupid, really. The original arcade game, directed by animator Don Bluth and developed by Cinematronics, ran on Laserdisc hardware and played more like an interactive cartoon than a conventional game. If you didn't realise, the technology within the GameCube, which was ostensibly the same as in the Game Boy Color, was not built for movie games on the go, considering it was tech from 1989. Translating the Dragon's Lair experience to Nintendo's tiny handheld with its limited cartridge space and modest CPU seemed nearly impossible. Developer Digital Eclipse, who are this meme when it comes to their ports really, managed the impossible though. They approached the problem by recreating the arcade scenes as simplified single-screen action rooms with shapes more so than faces and stuff. Each encounter mirrors a famous moment from the original game, with them collapsing floors, swinging blades and arse-blasting difficulty, but rendered with sprites and straightforward movement rather than full animation. The result is still Dragon's Lair at heart. You guide Dirk through rooms where the correct movement or timing is required to survive, echoing the trial and error structure of the arcade version. What makes it impressive though is how recognisable it remains. Despite the drastic hardware downgrade, the GBC port preserves the sequence of traps and the overall feel of Dirk stumbling through danger. It really is essentially Dragon's Lair compressed into an 8-bit puzzle action format. Yeah, really, you won't want to play it today. You probably won't want to play Dragon's Lair in general today, but considering we were still a bit away from SpongeBob episodes on the GBA, this was not a bad attempt at all. You shouldn't die for it though, of course. Now where did I leave my katana? The original Daikatana is remembered less for its gameplay and more for its mental development and infamous marketing campaign led by John Romero. It attempted to push the limits of first-person shooters at the time, but instead just test the limits of how many times you can go in circles before you just wander off. This is a long-winded way of saying the main game is actually a bit right, but the Game Boy Color port is actually really good. You see, instead of attempting a doomed first-person port, it reimagines the game as a top-down action-adventure, blending shooting, exploration, and some light puzzle-solving. You move through labyrinthine stages, collecting new weapons, unlocking doors, and fighting enemies across multiple time periods. It ends up feeling closer to a hybrid of Zelda-style exploration and arcade shooting than just a traditional FPS, and that works for its favour. What makes the port arguably the definitive way to play Daikatana if you have to play it anyway, is how much more structured it feels compared to its bigger brother. The progression across different eras remains much more consistent here, you almost always know what you're doing, and the game offers a surprising amount of content for such small hardware. Ironically, the Game Boy Color version is often regarded as one of the better games on the Game Boy Color itself, largely because its simpler design suits the platform far better than a man with beautiful hair threatening you with a bad time. The original console version of Driver 3, or Driv 3 to give it its government name, developed by Reflections Interactive and published by Atari, aimed to push the Driver series into full open-world territory with both driving and on-foot action, like the fulfilled potential of that second game that did both, but yeah. But just like me, when I learned my 5 times table faster than the rest of my class in year 2, that potential was never quite fulfilled. 5, 10, 15... 15 again. What makes the Game Boy Advance port, developed by them Wizards, Velez and Dubail, so surprising is how much it really wants to just be a handheld version of the PS2 and Xbox game. Rather than turning the game into a simple racer, the GBA version still features large open cities where you can freely drive, exit your vehicle and run about on foot. That alone is pretty bloody unusual for the hardware. The GBA rarely attempted open environments with both vehicles and character movement, yet Drithria manages police chases, mission objectives, and free roaming across sizable maps. VD Dev used a lot of the techniques they learned on the also amazing GBA version of V-Rally 3 here. Yes, obviously visually it's quite simplified in a lot of ways, but mechanically the game remains recognisable. You steal cars, evade the police, and move between objectives just like the console version. Now you do explode if you touch water as if you're from Rill, but swimming would probably make the GBA blow up. For a handheld from over 20 years ago, yeah, this kind of port should have been doomed. Porting Doom to the Game Boy Advance sounds unlikely, even if some crackhead is probably trying to make Doom work on the Game Boy camera as we speak, but the result from back in 2001 is surprisingly close to the real thing. The original game from id Software had already proven famously portable-ish across PCs and console. Even so, fitting it onto a handheld in 2001 was a different challenge entirely. And it's a challenge to me to figure out how they managed to engineer this from the Jaguar port source code, but they did. They did. The conversion was handled by David A. Palmer Productions, and rather than reinventing the game, the studio delivered a straight adaptation of the original campaign. Levels, weapons, enemies, and the core run and gun pacing are all recognisable and still, pretty fun. What I love about this one is just how much better it fares than earlier console attempts at Doom-style shooters. Some are not that surprising. Various Doom ports from the mid-90s famously had to cut levels, reduce enemy types, change the audio to farts, and simplify the game heavily just to run. By contrast, the GBA version feels far more complete. Aside from darker visuals and some trimmed enemy counts, it largely delivers the same experience you know and love. Yeah, you don't want to deal with the aiming these days, but for a handheld from the early 2000s, essentially a full version of Doom running on a device powered by 2 AA batteries is pretty remarkable. And then they did it again with Doom 2. Pretty neat indeed. All 4 of you N-Gage sickos who have been waiting for this day on the channel, your time has come. If you want an N-Gage documentary, you know where to go. Not to the therapist, no, just go in the comments. Bringing Tony Hawk's Pro Skater to handheld had already produced some inventive and genuinely very, very fun reinterpretations on the Game Boy Advance, but the N-Gage version takes a different approach. Developed by IdeaWorks 3D and published by Nokia, it attempts something far more ambitious. A fully 3D portable Tony Hawk game. In 2003. Rather than converting the game into an isometric or top-down format, the N-Gage hardware is pushed to deliver a structure more closer to the console originals. You skate around compact 3D parks, complete objectives within a time limit, and chain tricks together using familiar mechanics, while trying to deal with the weird portrait view that means you can't really see a lot at all really, but still. That alone is fairly impressive given the hardware. The N-Gage was essentially a mobile phone trying to function as a handheld console, yet it still manages 3D levels, multiple skaters, trick combos, and recognisable course design. Put it this way, like 3 years earlier, mobile games looked like this. Now, granted, controls can be a bit awkward due to the N-Gage's unusual button layout that demands you have 4 hands and 2 brains and also a cat who can help you out on the side, but mechanically the game holds together quite well. It ends up feeling like a scaled-down version of the PlayStation era games that sold millions of cans of Red Bull. The audio, however, is about as graceful as Phil Margera trying to do a kickflip. For a device often remembered as, well, it's actually not remembered that often at all, really. But this is a surprisingly convincing take on a portable skateboarding game. The console versions of Spider-Man 3 developed by Treyarch built on the open-world structure introduced in Spider-Man 2, but just didn't have the same source, did they? Just like the third movie itself, you could say, but this isn't your favourite image board in 2007. We don't need to talk about the Spider-Man 3 movie anymore. Swinging Across Manhattan had become the movie adaptation series' defining feature, so translating that to a handheld was a fairly daunting task. The PlayStation Portable version, developed by Vicarious Visions, manages something surprisingly close. Instead of breaking the game into small stages, it still features a freely explorable version of New York City, where you can swing between buildings, fight street crimes, and tackle story missions. What makes this especially amazing is that the earlier Spider-Man 2 game on PSP wasn't actually open world at all. You know, the Spider-Man 2 game that basically redefined what superhero games could be? That one played more like Spider-Man the movie on PlayStation 2, built around like linear missions rather than a fully navigatable city with a thriving pizza economy. Spider-Man 3 on the PSP changes that completely. The city is smaller and simplified, but the core systems, you know, your web swimming and traversal, combat, and side activities are all intact. It even has Bruce Campbell back doing tutorial stuff.
Hey, you're not a real hero until you save someone's life, right? Otherwise, you're just a guy in long underwear who hits people.
For a handheld in 2007, being able to freely swing around a portable Manhattan was still a pretty impressive trick. When the Warriors launched on PS2 and Xbox, it stood out as one of the more unusual projects from Rockstar Games. You know, back when they could release more than 2 games every 15 years. Based on the 1979 cult film, it turned a relatively short movie into a surprisingly large brawler, complete with story missions, side activities, and a detailed recreation of late 70s New York. It is also just really random to adapt a movie like nearly 30 years on from its release. Imagine if, I don't know, Dragonheart got a game today? Is there any Dragonheart fans in the chat? 2 years after its 2005 home console release, it arrived on the PlayStation Portable, developed by Rockstar Leeds, and the result is pretty remarkable, really. Rather than carving the game into smaller pieces, the PSP version retains the full campaign, the same coming out to play, yay, and even the 2-player co-op mode. Visually, it is obviously pared back quite a bit compared to the PS2 release, but it still looks great on the smaller screen. The character models in particular are still a bit of alchemy, really. You've got recognisable gang members with expressive faces and chunky animations that feel far more detailed than the hardware should really allow. Considering the size of the original game, the PSP version feels less like a handheld adaptation and more like a full console experience somehow compressed onto a portable system. Quite the show of force. The console release of Star Wars The Force Unleashed was pitched as a major technical showcase for LucasArts, built around flashy physics systems, killing stars, and large-scale action. Basically the video game version of that Linkin Park song, hell yeah brother. It introduced players to Starkiller, Darth Vader's secret apprentice, and was all about using force powers that could fling enemies and objects across the screen while being a bit of a naughty boy. Trying to replicate that spectacle on handheld hardware sounds about as smart as making a new movie based on Rey in 2026, but the PSP version, developed by Chrome Studios, holds together surprisingly well. The core structure is basically intact. You still fight through story missions using a mix of lightsaber combat and force abilities like lightning, pushes, and throws. The campaign closely follows the main narrative, and the portable version even adds extra content such as dual modes and additional unlockables. Naturally, the environments are simplified compared to the console versions, but the combat system still feels recognisably Force Unleashed. You're juggling enemies, blasting them across rooms, and generally making a mess of stormtroopers, and it all chugs along pretty nicely too. For a handheld release, it captures the series' power fantasy remarkably well, essentially turning the PSP into a pocket-sized Jedi power trip. And if you want something kinda similar, the Dante's Inferno PSP port is also quite remarkable. When Mortal Kombat 9 or 2011, or just Mortal Kombat if you're weird, rebooted the long-running series on consoles, it was a major comeback for the franchise. Can't win every reboot, eh? Developed by NetherRealm Studios and led by series co-creator Ed Boon, the game combined modern visuals with classic 2D fighting mechanics and a surprisingly lengthy story mode. It's gone on to be regarded as one of the best games in the whole series. The PlayStation Vita version, released the following year, is impressive simply because it's almost the entire console game running on a handheld. The full roster is present, the story campaign is intact, and the fast responsive fighting system survives the transition without much compromise. It does have some visual simplification compared to the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 versions, but on the Vita's OLED screen, it still looks pretty sharp. Character animations remain smooth, arenas are still really recognisable and look great, and the series' famously over-the-top fatalities are all still here and are all still very hard to show on YouTube in 2026. The handheld version even adds extra content, including challenge towers and touchscreen minigames designed specifically for the Vita. It also, of course, has Kratos, a character who should be in all fighting games. Even that one with the horses, you know, the one. For a portable fighting game, it's an unusually complete package. Essentially, Mortal Kombat 9 in your pockets, which felt pretty crazy when the Vita launched and sold 100 million units, and we all loved it forever. Yes, we did. We did. I did. Few ports sound more ridiculous than The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt running on the Nintendo Switch. You see, the original RPG from CD Projekt Red was famous for its enormous open world, dense cities, and technically demanding visuals when it launched on consoles like the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, so on the Switch, that should be impossible, right? The Switch version, developed with assistance from port specialist Saber Interactive, takes on the nearly impossible task of squeezing the entire experience onto a handheld system, and it's all fairly playable. What makes it so impressive is that pretty much nothing was removed. The full campaign is here along with both major expansions, Hearts of Stone and Blood and Wine, and it all comes on a cart too. The massive world of Velen, Novigrad and Skellige is still fully explorable with the same quests, characters and systems. Naturally, the visuals do take a hit, a pretty big hit really, we can't lie. Resolution is lower, textures are simplified, and there's a lot of that crystallized look on a bunch of the assets. Even so, the game still manages to look surprisingly good on the smaller screen. Considering the scale of the original release, the Switch version feels like a small technical miracle. You really want to play it on Switch 2 or the Steam Deck these days, but The Witcher 3 really made everyone wonder what could be squeezed out of Nintendo's wonderful little hybrid. No, that is too much. Please unsqueeze it and put it back in the orange. Or whatever. Outro gang, here's a quick question for you. I just thought I'd come on video. Do you think it's authentic? Anyone that knows more GBA stuff than me? It looks quite clean and it was quite cheap. I'm not too sure. Anyway, I've been Jim from Cultured Vultures. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you when I catch you. Is that what I usually say? Bye.